Right, afternoon everybody, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed the earlier session. So there was lots of chats going on Slido, so that was good to see, lots of interaction. Hope you all enjoyed the breakout sessions as well. I can see a few technical gremlins as we work out where to go and where interactive programs are and things like that. But I think everybody broadly made it safe and sound. So I hope those were all helpful and good, and welcome back to the final session of our conference today. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce our final speaker, who's John Yates, the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund. But before I do that, a reminder to please do tweet away for those of you on Twitter using our hashtag #HousingLearningWork. Also, please do put your comments and questions for John into the Q&A on there as well. We're trying to go through as many of those as possible. I know we've been doing a poll earlier, and we were a bit unsure about the extent to which levelling up is going to sort of all happen as we hope, which I think was probably my answer as well. And we've now got one final poll that we're going to ask you all to vote in, please. So this is if you plan to engage with lead authorities in the Shared Prosperity Fund, are you confident about doing so? So some fairly self-explanatory answers here. So yes, feeling confident about it. No, not sure, don't know, or was working it through. Basically, we're planning our approach. So please do get voting away. I can see some of those votes totting up at the moment. So we'll come back to the result of that poll in a little bit. And as I say, please do put your questions and comments for John into the chat as well. So John, we're really pleased that you're here with us this afternoon. We've covered a lot of ground during the course of the morning, everything from levelling up and shared prosperity funds and green skills, and a bit of Brexit in there as well from our first speaker, and lots of stuff going on. So we're really interested to hear your perspective about how you or how we strengthen communities, how we build those connections, how that links into levelling up, what we can all do collectively to make some progress on that front. So I'll hand over to you to give us your starter for 10, and then we'll bring in some of the questions that people are asking in the chat later on as well.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and it's very nice to at least digitally be with you all wherever you find yourself today. I'm going to speak pretty briefly for about 12 minutes and just hopefully give everyone something to think about, and then delighted to discuss it from there. As Stephen mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, which is a fund that exists to find what works to reduce youth violence and to build a movement to put it into practice. But I've also written and thought quite a lot about how do we build more strengthened, stronger communities. And so this is a marvellous title that Stevens and the team have given me, about strengthening communities and levelling up. I think that the truth is that the average person thinks we've got a problem with our communities. I say that because half of British people, when asked, say that they think that their communities are more divided than ever before. It's not just a British problem. 80% of Americans, always good when we come out slightly better than the Americans, 80% of Americans think that their communities are either entirely or mainly divided. We seem to have a problem with division, at least a perception of it. And I think that perception is actually pretty much right. I think that is a problem. And I think we can see it most clearly, if we're honest, in our friendships. Because what does community mean? It's one of these words that gets used all over the place. And I think it probably most truthfully means the strength of our relationships with each other. And if you look at the friendships that most of us have, we find that half of those of us who have degrees have almost no friends without a degree. The vast majority of those of us who are retired across the West have no contact with anyone under the age of 35 unless we're related. A quarter of those of us who voted to remain in the EU and a quarter of those of us who voted to leave the EU have no friends who voted the other way. Half of us have no friends from a different ethnic background. And the biggest divide of all, at least here in the UK, remains class. So a barrister operating in London would have to invite 100 people round that they knew. They have to go all the way to the 100th person before they would be likely to invite someone who was unemployed. We live in these little silos, and I think it really matters. Now, the average person, again, I think would probably say, oh, come on, John. Haven't we always been a bit like this? And if we're honest, don't birds of a feather just flock together? And once again, I think the average person is broadly right. And I say that because the evidence is on their side. There was a man called Francis Evans who in 1953 travelled up and down the breadth of the United States of America. And he followed a load of people doing door-to-door sales, pretty much the first job I ever did in life. And they were selling life insurance. And what Evans did is he tracked when they made a sale and when they struck out. And he found they were more likely to make a sale if they were selling to someone who voted the same way that they did. They were more likely to make a sale if they sold to someone who had the same level of income as they did. They were more likely to make a sale if they sold to someone who was the same height as they were. Why? Well, what Francis Evans had discovered, and 39,000 following articles came to the same conclusion, is we have a small, but constant bias towards people who remind us of ourselves, a small but constant bias towards people who remind us of ourselves. And this has been found from Kuala Lumpur to Kingston, affecting who we do academic research with, who we work with, who we sit next to at the lunch hall, and who we befriend. Academics call this homophily. They love to use a bit of Greek, homophily, liking the same, homophily. I prefer the term people like me syndrome. The truth is we all suffer from this small constant bias, people like me syndrome. And it's fundamentally why there can be a problem of division in our societies. So the question really should be, why has this got a bit worse recently? And I believe it has got worse over the last half century. And to understand that, we need to take a trip to northern Tanzania. Now, in northern Tanzania, there on the shore of Lake Yates is a tribe called the Hadza, and there are about 4,000 members of the Hadza tribe, and they've lived there for about 60,000 years. And they are super interesting. First of all, they're hunter-gatherers. So they're hunter-gatherers in the modern era, but that's not the most interesting thing about the Hadza. The most interesting thing about the Hadza is something they do once a month. So once a month, when the moon is gone from the sky and everything is pitch black, the Hadza gather together with other Hadza who are sleeping near, and they perform something called the apem. The apem is basically a dance, and it works like this. What happens is the men go and hide, normally behind some trees nearby, and the first man comes out and he has a headdress of black ostrich feathers and a black cape, and he's holding a rattle, and he's got bells around one ankle, and he leads off in a dance. And then the women join in, and often children would join the dance as well. And this will last for 2 or 3 hours. Now, what is the point of the apem? It serves no obvious purpose in Hadza society. It doesn't resolve disputes. It's not part of some sort of religious set of beliefs. It's not to try and make the economy work better. It doesn't help them hunt and gather. There's no obvious purpose to it at all. And a group of anthropologists got enough funding to follow the Hadza for 10 years, amazing piece of funding. And they followed the Hadza to try and find out what was going on. And they tracked something really important. They tracked who do the Hadza trust? Who do they share tools with? Who do they bed down near to? Who do they gossip with? And they found the Hadza tend to trust 2 types of other Hadza more than others. The first is other Hadza they're really closely related to, so members of their close family. In other words, people like them, people like me syndrome. So the Hadza have a bias towards people like them. We might look at the Hadza as one tribe. They see themselves as a group of separate families. So their first bias is towards people like them, just like we talked about a moment ago. But here's the thing. The second group of people that the Hadza trust are the people they dance the apem with. And actually, they trust the people they dance the apem with more than they trust their own family. They're more likely to share tools, more likely to bed down near them, more likely to gossip with them. What is the point of the apem? The point of the APEM is it builds community for the Hadza. It connects them together. To use our modern language, it makes diversity work. We don't have a term for an institution that builds that sort of connection together across lines of difference. We don't have a term for it. I suggest we call it the common life. The Hadza have a common life. It is the APEM. And once you have that term, the common life, actually you can see them all over the place. If you look at human history, we started off as foragers and we had these sort of rituals that connected us together. We became farmers and we lost those rituals, but we found a new way to connect, largely often through organized religion, through rites of passage, through feast days. And these were quite a big deal. So the average English person in the 15th century spent 1 in 5 days in some sort of feast day event. When we became factory workers, we lost a lot of that, but we came together in time through clubs and societies, which boomed in the 18th and 19th century. And we started sending our kids to mandatory schooling, where they mixed with people we didn't know. And we went to workplaces, a pretty new invention in the 18th, 19th century, where we connected again with people we didn't know. A new common life was born. Why have we become more divided? Why have we become weaker in our communities? A key part of it is the decline of that common life, the common life that connected our grandparents and our great-grandparents together. Every generation since the Second World War has been less likely to join a club or a society than the one before it. Of course, we still send our kids to school and we still are in workplaces, at least pandemic permitting, but we tend increasingly to spend that time with people who are quite like us. Our schools are now more segregated than our communities. Our workplaces increasingly are full of people with the same level of education as ourselves. Why has this happened? Why has this common life, this set of institutions that glue us together, gone into decline? Well, the good news is I can tell you. The bad news is the two villains of the piece, the things I really like. The first one is choice. The truth is, the more choice we have, the more we choose to spend time with people like us. And we've introduced more and more choice into schools and more choice into where we work. And I relish that choice. I like being able to choose. I think choice can really improve things. But when we choose, people like me syndrome plays in, and we choose to be with people like us. What about the clubs and societies? We always chose to be part of them. No one forced us. So what's got changed there? Well, the second villain is change. Fast technological and economic and societal change disrupts voluntary associations. Let me explain that very simply. So we look at clubs and societies. The biggest change, arguably, of the last century is the invention of the television. Nothing has probably had more impact on the decline in club societies than the invention of the TV, pulling us away, giving us something else to do rather than go out in the cold and meet with people we don't know. And so these institutions have been disrupted. And I think this matters. I think the loss of this common life really weakens our communities, and it has a real impact. And I explain more in the book, but it reduces social mobility because it's the networks that help young people get on. It makes our democracy much more vulnerable. It reduces the speed of growth of our economy because the sharing of ideas is so critical. It makes our country less secure to radicalization. It is bad news. It also makes us more anxious. So the question is, as I come to land, what do we do about it? And I generally have a lot of hope about the future. I think if you can diagnose a problem, you can try to do something about the problem. And the first thing I'd say is the government seems very keen on talking about levelling up. So let's take them on their word. If this government is serious about levelling up, it needs to think how to build more connected communities. And that means it has to make a choice. And it's got 3 options when it comes to restoring the common life. It can either do nothing about it at all, which is broadly what every Western country is doing at the moment. It's just letting our common life institutions decline. I don't think that's a very good idea, but it is the default option. The second is to say, yes, change does disrupt our clubs and society, our societal life. We just try and slow down the rate of change. Maybe protect jobs more, maybe have less movement of people, maybe do something to try and sustain our standard values. This is actually the approach that the Scandinavian countries have taken, and their clubs and societies have held up. I just don't think it's credible. I don't think we can slow down the rate of change, especially with technology moving into our lives so fast. So what's the third option? The third option is not to do something, it's not to do nothing. It's not to slow change. It's to query how much we have to always be able to choose everything we do. It sounds an appalling thing to suggest. Surely this is fascism. What I'm suggesting, though, isn't that extraordinary. What I'm saying is we could learn from a country that feels like it's on the other side of the world, because it is, which is Singapore, where they have introduced moments you have to spend with people who you didn't choose to spend time with, whether through the way schooling is organised, whether through national service, or even in their case through housing. I don't suggest we do that, but I do think we could think about having an institution that knitted children together as a rite of passage as they become teenagers, to do something together in their community. I think we could have an institution that when you start a family, you learn about your child's brain and how it develops with other parents you don't know from your community. And I think we could have a retirement program, something for people as they step away from the world of work to actually reconnect with their community. 3 new institutions to knit our country together. Now, you might well think, as I close, that this sounds completely inconceivable, the idea that we would be required to spend time with strangers. And I would just say to that when we look at all the big changes that have happened over the last 100 years, where the government's had any role at all, from the creation of a national health service, to the joining of the EU, to the mass privatisations, to the departure from the EU, whatever we think of those innovations, they all started off as completely inconceivable until they became imaginable, until they became likely, until they became unavoidable. And I want to argue that these sort of ideas need to move from being inconceivable to being unavoidable. But there's also stuff that we can do. And I know that I sit here with people who think frequently about housing, about skills, and about supporting other citizens. And we can find ways to say, what is the APEM in the way we operate? What is the space that brings together people who think of themselves as different and connects them and builds trust? In other words, we can look at a problem like this and we can find a way to be the change we want to see in the world. Thank you very much indeed.
Fabulous, thanks, John. As ever, incredibly thought-provoking, and we've travelled from door-to-door salesman in the US to Tanzania to a third way at the end as well. So a tour of time and space there. Loads to think about, loads to pick up. I can see some questions coming through, so do please keep those coming through. Perhaps if I kind of we'll talk in a second about what we can do now. I just wanted to kind of pick you up on something you talked about, previous shifts we've been through. So, for example, sort of industrial revolution, and we shift from those agrarian traditions, and then we have to invent new ones for urban industrialized societies. What's your sense about, I mean, there's no simple answer to this, but what's your sort of general sense about how those new traditions or common life elements came about? Was it people wanted them and they created them, or did government have to push some of this? How do they emerge in general?
Yeah, so I don't think anyone planned them to try and do something about cohesion. I don't think people invented organized religion as a way, as primarily as a tool to connect people, though we should recognize religion comes from, second Greek moment, I think this is Latin actually, comes from the word which means to bind. So there was a recognition that it had this impact, but I don't think anyone was sort of seriously trying to do that as the primary purpose. And I don't think anyone created schooling as a primary purpose of connecting people, or the workplace, the corporation as a primary, but they did have this impact. And the state, particularly when we got into being factory workers, the state really was very active. I mean, schools have been around forever, but they only became mandatory in 1880 in the UK. And I think there was a point at which the idea they'd be mandatory was inconceivable. And then they did become mandatory. And so the state has actually been quite active recently in some of these institutions, but I don't think it was the intent. And so I do think, like I say, the option one is to do nothing. I do think something will spring up. Like, things do come up. These institutions are of value, and I do think they will spring up. They just could take a very long time. So it took 1,000 years from the decline of the foraging institutions before the farming institutions arrived, and about 100 years or so before the factory ones came. And those gaps are some of the most sort of violent and vulnerable periods of human history. And so it seems to me a reasonable element of public policy to say, actually, probably we should try and intervene a bit here.
I think I'll ask one more question just flowing on from that, and then I will go through some of the questions. I'm taking chair's privilege here a little bit, to be honest. But I'm kind of, yeah, it'd be great not to have to wait 1,000 years for something else to kind of spring up itself. I'm interested a little bit about how are we kind of fighting against the tide a little bit here, and therefore it kind of does need that sort of nudge over, whether it's from society, whatever that means, or government, or does some of this stuff also happen naturally? For example, you mentioned education. So I wrote a report years ago when I worked for a think tank, proposing lotteries for school entry. This is the sort of thing think tanks come up with every now and again, and it's completely political and feasible because people have spent a lot of money to buy houses in catchment areas for good schools. But part of the argument is to try and get some of that social mixing that you don't get otherwise. And you know, like you mentioned the television, actually sort of last 10-15 years, Netflix, streaming, 24-hour news, there's far more bubbles to put yourself into than there was when there was 3 or 4 or 5 channels. So to what extent are people, you talked about people naturally sort of forming themselves into people like us. Do we have to sort of jumpstart people out of that, and then actually they kind of see the value in meeting people not like me? Or is there something innate in human nature that we're trying to sort of push against a little bit here?
Yeah, so I think 2 things. The first thing is, as I say, there is a natural instinct towards people like me. I think we just have to recognise, I don't have to debate the research, but the research is so sound and clear that this bias exists. But who is a person like me is actually really malleable. So we don't have we're not born with a fixed idea of what is the defining identity of who I am. Most of us have interlocking complex identities that cross-cut a suite of things. I'll just give one small example. I ended up volunteering on a program for a year, and there were 2 people of faith of this group of 12. My dad was a vicar, I grew up a committed Christian, still am. Jawad, committed Sunni Muslim, lives in Pakistan. He and I became very close. And I think at the end, someone might say, well, of course they became faith. They're both people of faith. But that wasn't the original thought. The original thought, remember, the people who put the program together, this would be interesting. These people are so different, you know, these different faiths. Now, a lot of us have things in common that we don't necessarily notice. And it's only by spending time together that we pick them up and then we start to connect. And humans are actually phenomenally good at connecting. It's actually one of the things that makes us able to live, you know, in the food chain where we live. We're not particularly strong, we're not particularly fast, we work together well. We have the ability to connect. There's a whole suite of adaptations we've got, but this bias gets in the way. And so I do think actually creating natural ways to bring people into joint activity, normally not talking, normally doing something, actually plays into the things we like, and then we enjoy spending time together.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's somebody's posted in the chat that actually one of their quotes that I heard elsewhere is about the best thing you can do for people is to find an excuse to bring them together. Actually, it was kind of, and you're right, kind of people like us can kind of mean different things at different points in time for each of us, but also at the same time. I think that's a really important point. There's a couple of themes that have come out of some of the questions coming through, so I might just try and pick up on. To be honest, we could talk for hours, and I'm going to have to try and edit myself here. But so one is about well, partly about the internet, but also about how we persuade people or help people to kind of think through issues. And people mentioned like QAnon and stuff like this, and echo chambers and that sort of stuff. So and the relation to adult education in this. So a lot of adult education is about how you help people to think through things they want to think through, or you know, we talked about vaccines recently. You don't get over people worried about vaccines just by telling them the facts. You know, it's not like broadcast mode. Here's the facts. Oh, okay then. So how can the sort of things that you're talking about play into that sort of role of adult education within that, and then also that sort of broader swathe of what it means to be a citizen, I suppose, in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's great question. I mean, I think on adult education, particularly community-based adult education, has a colossal role to play in building this connection between people who might see each other as somewhat different. And I think it hasn't been. I think it hasn't always taken the opportunity to explain that this is the value of what we're doing because of this. And part of the reason for writing the book was to try and give people the arguments that they can make, because I think too often the word is community, and everyone who has hands on money tends to go, oh, soft. not real, softness. Oh, you're doing something nice, that's lovely. Whereas I wanted to say, no, the evidence is quite strong that if you can connect people together, you can get better social mobility outcomes, faster economic growth, better health outcomes. And so I'm delighted if people working on adult education can sort of make those arguments more forcefully to the Treasury and to the DfE and to others. The internet, I think the internet has been a challenge, because anything that, I love the internet, don't get me wrong, I love the internet, I love TV, I love loads of the things that I think also have problems. The challenge with the internet is the more easy it is to choose who to connect with and who to follow, the more you would tend to follow people like you. That's why social media tends to be more segregated than our schools. And so that's the worry. And I think a lot of the information problem is because you're in a little echo chamber, and we could obviously talk about that much more, but the more we can connect people with different views in a positive way, I think the more you protect people from some of those echo chambers.
Yeah, I think Stephen Bush wrote an article about the Netflix algorithm just kind of constantly recommending the same sorts of things, and actually they're okay, but where do you get you something different? I've got time to ask you one more question, which a number of people have asked about the sorts of things they can do in their jobs to sort of create some of that common life you were talking about. So you've got people here working for housing associations, working for local authorities, adult education services, training providers, employment services, that sort of thing. And I know there's lots of actually really interesting initiatives going along. I remember funding an intergenerational centre when I worked for the Mayor of London previously, and there's lots of these things that do happen to a greater or lesser extent now. But what would be your advice, or some of the really great examples you'd point to for some of the people on the event today?
Yeah, so three very practical things. So what the evidence shows, and I say that just to try and give people confidence when they're making this argument, is firstly three things to try and get right. The firstly is, can you attract people who genuinely think of themselves as different? And are you appealing to a diverse group? And obviously that can be age, that could be a social class, that could be religion, that could be ethnicity, but are you genuinely, and there's obviously things to think about, who's in your promotion material, who's reading your stuff, do people see themselves in the stuff you're promoting, are you genuinely managing to connect through community workers with different people living in the housing association, etc. So are you genuinely attracting a diverse group is the first thing, which is hugely valuable if you are and if you can. The second, then, you don't need both of these. The second is intensity. So the thing that tends to bond people together in a way that gives us these benefits to our economy and so on is either an intense shared experience, people doing something that gets them just their heart rate to raise just a little bit. Why? And that could be if they're not used to leaving an area, going to visit something. It could be just simple as that together. It could be doing something physically exercise. It could be presenting to others. It could be applying for a job and then sharing the story of feeling nervous about it. But an intense shared experience creates a memory, and that memory has the other people in it. And therefore those people feel like people like you because they were part of that experience. And the final one, which is easier in a way, is routine. For some reason, doing things together in a routinized way, meals is a particularly good example, but some sort of practice that we always go through, the way a meeting is done, it could be, creates a sense of we've all done this thing together. We all followed this way this meeting works. We all told our stories in a circle. We all ate a meal together. It creates trust. So the more you can do, get a diverse group, do something memorable, do something routine. That's what the evidence says. And that, I think, can be applied across all sorts of things. Doesn't mean it's always easy, but those are the things to hit.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. We are sadly out of time now. I could have talked to you for hours, but also you'd probably just hang up at some point as well, I suppose. But that's been immensely thought-provoking for me, and I can see by the stuff that's coming through on the chat for lots of people as well, and also a really good sense of sort of optimism and ideas about what we can do about this, which is really, really important as well. So these are themes that we at the Learning and Work Institute would certainly love to sort of keep picking it up and keep picking your brains on as well, and working with you. And I'm sure that's true of lots of people on this event as well. So thank you so much for your time today.
No, thanks so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Fabulous. Well, that's a kind of a very thought-provoking note to end on, and something to think about as you all go and grab some lunch, I'm sure, next. We've covered such a lot of ground across this morning, and not least with John there at the end. So I hope you've all found today's event really useful and thought-provoking and interesting, lots of examples and making connections as well. I'm really grateful to John and to all of the other speakers that we've had across today's event for giving their time and their brain power and their ideas and their examples as well. Really grateful, as I said at the start, to our sponsors, to ABRI, to Sofin and to Clarion Housing. Without them, we couldn't do events like this. And a huge thanks to all 570, I think, people who signed up to take part in today's event as well, and for all of the input on the polls and the chats that we've had. I realised, having mentioned polls, that I've completely failed to share the results of the final poll. So I'm going to try and squeeze that in quickly, if I may. So there you go. So how confident are you engaging with those lead SPF authorities? Starting to plan, not sure, fewer confident. I think that's probably about right, given the detail that we haven't quite got as yet, and that is still to come. Hopefully, when we rerun this poll, if we rerun this poll in the autumn, everyone will be feeling much more confident about it all. But you know, fingers crossed on that one. So thank you for voting in that poll and the other one that we had earlier. Huge thanks to communities that work, I should say, as well, and Lindsay. We love doing this conference in partnership and jointly with communities that work, who bring a sort of different perspective, and I think stronger together is probably the phrase that works, given what John's just been talking about as well. So on behalf of Lindsay, I was about to speak on behalf of you there. A big thanks, I'm sure, from you to all of the speakers and sponsors and delegates as well.
Absolutely, thank you, Stephen.
And lastly from me, a big thank you to the Learning and Work team who've worked so hard to put today together as well, alongside Lindsay as well. So particularly to Sam and to Rasheen and to Helena for putting together the programme, setting it all up, and the interactive programme, and making today run so smoothly as well. So we're very grateful to the brilliant Learning and Work team, who, as ever, have done a fantastic job. So thank you, everybody. I hope it's been useful. Who knows, hopefully, you never know, this time next year we might be able to meet in person. That would be great, wouldn't it? So fingers crossed we can do that. In the meantime, I hope today's given you lots to think about and lots to take away, and we look forward to carrying on to work with you all. So thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.